Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to a Roman feast where lavish banquets were held in the grandest halls, and emperors dined with opulence that would make even today's most extravagant parties look like simple backyard barbecues. Picture a room filled with food so plentiful that it spills off the tables, platters of exotic delicacies, and wine flowing in rivers. You can almost feel the smooth marble underfoot as slaves scurry about, serving the emperor and his elite guests. But here's a little reality check for you. You probably wouldn't survive this feast. At least, not without a crash course in Roman dining etiquette. The Romans, ever so careful with their social status, wouldn't let just anyone walk in off the street and join these meals. There were strict rules about who sat where and who ate what. And stepping out of line could be, well, it could get you kicked out, or worse. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop your location and local time in the comments. I'm always curious about where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Roman banquets, especially those hosted by emperors, were not just about food. They were spectacles, political statements wrapped in extravagance. Imagine the emperor seated at the head of a lavish table with hundreds, sometimes thousands, of guests gathered to witness not just his culinary selection, but his power, wealth, and influence. These were events where food, drink, and entertainment came together to craft a narrative of imperial might. The banquets were more than meals. They were performances designed to cement the emperor's position in the eyes of his people. The food was only one part of the experience. Think about the scale of these events. We're talking about banquets that could last for hours, even days, with courses being served one after another, each more extravagant than the last. The Romans didn't just dine for sustenance. They dined for show, to express their greatness to those around them. At the height of these feasts, emperors would serve up over 100 dishes in a single sitting. The wealthy could afford such opulence, but the lesser classes, sadly, would have to settle for far less. The idea, however, was to set apart the elites from the rest of society, not just by their wealth, but by their taste, their refinement. In this environment, the emperor's position was reinforced by how they treated food. It wasn't just about indulging in a meal. It was about controlling the narrative of the empire. A feast was a statement. a moment for the emperor to remind everyone of his divine right to rule. In fact, historians still argue whether these banquets were more about nourishing the body or about nourishing the emperor's image as an almost godlike figure. So, as the first course is laid out, imagine the aroma of exotic spices, the sizzle of roasted meats, and the wine, rich and potent, filling the air. But it wasn't always just about sumptuous feasts. Some emperors, when they were feeling particularly playful, might choose to host banquets designed not only to impress their guests, but to keep them on edge, guessing what would come next. Sometimes the feasts were sprinkled with strange twists. How about a banquet where the menu was written in riddles, and the guests had to solve them to know what food they would be served? Talk about a dinner party with a little extra spice, right? Historians often debate whether this was a tactic to keep the guests in line, or simply a bit of Roman humor at the expense of the elite. Now, as you settle into this Roman feast, you may wonder, what would you be eating? Let's take a look at what typically graced the tables of Roman emperors. Let's dive right into the food. The food, where even the most seemingly mundane dishes were elevated to the status of fine art. Imagine this. You're sitting at a banquet in ancient Rome, surrounded by the best of Roman society. The servers bring in the first course, and it's not just a simple platter of bread and cheese. Oh no, that wouldn't do for an emperor. What arrives is a complex dish that's been carefully prepared to not just satisfy hunger, but to showcase wealth and sophistication. In Roman banquets, food wasn't just food. It was a powerful statement, a reflection of the emperor's rule. And while there might be some familiar elements, bread, wine, fruits, the real intrigue lies in the exotic flavors and textures. You might expect meats like roasted pork, lamb, and even wild game. But there were also far stranger offerings. Let's talk about the delicacies that made Roman banquets legendary. Things like stuffed dormice. Yes, you heard that right. Dormice. These small rodents, stuffed with meat or seasoned with a variety of herbs, were considered a delicacy. Not your average dinner guest, I'd say. But this was the Roman Empire. Nothing was too outlandish. You might have been served pulse, a type of porridge made from farro, or the more luxurious libum, a cheesecake-like dessert that was served at almost every feast. Historians still argue about the exact ingredients of Roman cheesecakes, with some claiming it had honey and bay leaves, while others insist it was just simple cheese. For drink, wine flowed freely, often mixed with water, as the Romans were known to dilute their wine. If you were an emperor, your wine might even be spiced with herbs and fruits creating a heady concoction designed to leave guests in a hazy, satisfied stupor. Ever wonder why they mixed wine with water? Well, that wasn't just for taste. It was also practical. Wine was often watered down to make it go further, especially since good wine was expensive. You wouldn't want to run out halfway through the banquet, would you? There's also the possibility that this was done to moderate the effects of alcohol. Roman emperors were not known for their moderation, but they had to keep their guests somewhat functional. And then there were the fruits. Roman banquets had an astonishing variety of fruits and berries, which were often served as desserts or as palate cleansers between the main courses. Think figs, dates, and pomegranates, rich in symbolism and flavor. But while those may sound fairly familiar, the Romans also enjoyed something much more exotic: apricots. These fruits, native to Armenia, were a rare treat. Historians have even found evidence suggesting that the Romans were one of the first major civilizations to cultivate apricots. Talk about trendsetters. But let's not forget the strange and bizarre offerings that marked Roman extravagance. Imagine walking into a banquet where an entire boar is brought out, its stomach stuffed with smaller birds and even more exotic meats. And you can hear the crackling skin as it's sliced and served. The goal? To wow the guests, of course. But here's where things get even stranger. You might also have been served a dish made from flamingo tongues. Yes, flamingo tongues, considered an indulgence for the rich and powerful. This dish is as extravagant as it gets. Historians argue about whether this was purely a status symbol or if it actually tasted good, with some suggesting it was all about the rarity of the ingredients rather than the taste. In these moments, the emperor wasn't just feeding his guests. He was feeding their imaginations, playing to their desires for the exotic and the rare. As we continue our journey through these Roman feasts, let's take a step back and appreciate how they really used food to tell a story, not just of their wealth, but of their dominance over the known world. But we're still not done with the banquet menu, so stick with me as we dive into how these meals were carefully curated to ensure that the emperor remained the center of attention. Now that we've set the stage for the grandeur of Roman feasts, let's take a closer look at the secret ingredient behind these lavish events: the careful curation of the banquet menu. Imagine you're sitting at the feast, eagerly waiting for each course to arrive. But this isn't just about filling your stomach. No, the emperor has thought long and hard about what you will be served tonight and why. Every dish has a purpose, and it's all designed to reinforce his position as ruler, the divine figure at the center of the Roman world. In Roman culture, the act of feasting was an art form, a reflection of not just wealth, but also a display of imperial sophistication. The emperor didn't just throw together whatever food happened to be available. Instead, the menu was carefully planned, sometimes even months in advance. They had chefs, yes, professional chefs, who would painstakingly prepare dishes not just for flavor, but for appearance and symbolism. Each food item was selected for its visual impact, the textures, the colors, and how it would contribute to the overall ambiance of the evening. For instance, think about the vibrant, jewel-like colors of pomegranates and figs, which were not only delicious, but symbolic in Roman culture. Figs, for example, were associated with fertility and abundance. They were often featured prominently at banquets to symbolize the emperor's ability to provide and prosper. Pomegranates, meanwhile, had ties to the goddess Persephone, symbolizing life and death, making them a fitting choice for a feast where guests were treated to a little taste of the emperor's divine favor. But it wasn't just fruits and vegetables that received such careful attention. Meat was another area where Roman emperors showed off their wealth and power. You might be served venison or wild boar, meats that were reserved for the upper echelons of society. The very choice of meat was significant. It was meant to remind guests that the emperor, with his expansive empire, had the resources to supply the rarest delicacies. There's even evidence suggesting that certain emperors would order exotic animals from far-flung corners of the empire to be served at their feasts. For example, Emperor Heliogabalus was known for having elaborate feasts that included ostrich and even the meat of giraffes, animals so rare that serving them was a powerful statement of his control over distant lands. But here's the thing. Historians still argue about whether this was about genuine enjoyment of rare foods or if it was simply a game of one-upmanship. Was the goal to delight the senses or to remind everyone who was really in charge? After all, these meals weren't just about eating. They were about reinforcing a narrative. The emperor wanted everyone to know he was at the top of the food chain, and these banquets were just one more way to assert that. The process of menu curation didn't stop at the selection of food. The way the food was served was just as important. Sometimes, dishes were arranged in intricate patterns, creating a feast for the eyes as well as the stomach. They used intricate sculptures made from sugar and even garnishes carved into intricate shapes, often made from fruits and vegetables. The idea was to create a feast that felt almost like a work of art, a visual and sensory experience that captured the grandeur of the emperor's rule. And this wasn't just an isolated practice of the elites. The Roman public also had their own version of feasts, though on a much smaller scale. Public festivals and games often came with communal meals, where people gathered to feast together as part of a civic celebration. While these meals were far less lavish than the emperor's banquets, they still played an important role in the social fabric of the Roman world. They brought people together, reinforcing the shared cultural identity and the emperor's role as a unifying figure. As you imagine these banquets, think about the slow, deliberate pace of each course. These meals were not rushed affairs. They were leisurely, hours-long affairs meant to indulge the guests, giving them time to savor each bite and sip, to enjoy the entertainment, and to participate in the conversation. They were a sensory journey, meant to transport the guests into a world of luxury and indulgence. And for those at the top, it was all about power, prestige, and the ability to show just how far-reaching Roman influence truly was. Now, let's move on to another crucial aspect of Roman banquets: those who served the emperor and his guests. These individuals might not have had the luxury of enjoying the food themselves, but they played a key role in ensuring that the feast went off without a hitch. And trust me, it wasn't just about carrying trays of food. As we continue our journey through Roman feasts, let's pause and take a moment to consider those who made these grand affairs possible: the slaves. The role of slaves in Roman society, especially during these feasts, is often overlooked, but it was one of the most integral aspects of the entire banquet experience. You might have been lounging on a couch, relaxing as the emperor regally sips his wine. But behind the scenes, there were countless individuals working tirelessly to ensure everything ran smoothly. For the most part, they weren't even allowed to participate in the feast itself. No reclining on plush cushions, no sampling the exotic dishes. But they were essential to the event's success. Historians still argue about how slaves were treated during these feasts. Were they simply laborers, quietly going about their duties? Or were they more like silent witnesses to the empire's grandeur, perhaps even playing a role in the spectacle itself? While most slaves in the Roman Empire performed menial tasks, slaves at these banquets often had specialized roles, working as cooks, servers, or entertainers, bringing an extra layer of skill and precision to the banquet experience. Picture it. You're a Roman slave assigned to the emperor's banquet, and your task is to present the most luxurious dish of the night. You can't just throw some meat on a plate and call it a day. Oh no, you must present it with flair, arranged in such a way that it captivates the guests. Some slaves would even carve elaborate food sculptures, creating intricate designs that would leave guests marveling. Imagine the delicate balance of your emotions. On one hand, you're serving food to the elite, witnessing the emperor's power up close. On the other, you're reminded of your own position in society, serving those at the top while being denied the opportunity to partake in any of the splendor. But these slaves weren't just passive participants in the spectacle. No, they were an essential part of the experience, even though they were often invisible in the grand narrative. They worked behind the scenes, moving between the grand tables, serving endless courses, ensuring that no guest was ever without a fresh plate or goblet of wine. It was said that a successful banquet depended heavily on the skill of the slaves who served it. A well-timed course or a perfectly executed dish could earn a slave favor with the emperor, while a misstep could result in punishment. This leads us to a fascinating question that historians still debate today. How much of Roman society's enjoyment of feasts relied on the fact that the workers, the slaves, were so essential, yet so overlooked? Was the power dynamic at these feasts as much about reminding the elite of their own superiority over others as it was about celebrating the empire's wealth? It's an uncomfortable thought, but it's a crucial part of the historical context we have to keep in mind as we continue our journey through Roman dining culture. As we continue to explore these feasts, think about how all of this ties into Roman ideas of social hierarchy. The emperor, sitting at the head of the table, was the focal point of the entire banquet, and his guests were part of a carefully structured society, dictated not only by the emperor's whims, but by centuries of tradition. Where a person sat during a banquet was just as important as what they ate. The highest-ranking guests were given places near the emperor, while others were placed farther down the table, ensuring that every movement and every conversation reflected the strict social structure of Rome. But the banquets weren't just about eating and drinking. Oh no, they were about setting the stage for something much more profound: political power. Let's explore the fascinating political theater of these feasts, where every toast, every course, and every word spoken was loaded with meaning. Now that we've touched on the grand spectacle of Roman banquets and the essential role of slaves, let's explore the deeper political theater that unfolded during these feasts. While the food and wine were undeniably important, the true power of these banquets lay in their ability to shape the political landscape of the empire. You see, these were not just social gatherings. They were staged performances, carefully crafted to reinforce the emperor's dominance and to subtly influence the power dynamics within Roman society. Imagine yourself as a guest at one of these events. You're seated at a carefully chosen spot, perhaps not next to the emperor, but within view of his lofty position. As the courses are served, the emperor watches over the proceedings, offering toasts to the right individuals, making small talk with his closest allies, and even subtly nudging the conversation in certain directions. Every word spoken and every gesture made at the banquet was designed to send a message, either to reinforce an alliance or to send a quiet signal of disapproval. Emperors often used banquets as opportunities to solidify relationships with key figures in the empire. Important generals, senators, and other political leaders would be invited to these feasts to strengthen bonds and create a sense of loyalty. The lavishness of the banquet served as a reminder of the emperor's power and ability to provide. In return, the emperor could count on these guests to publicly support him, or at least remain silent in the face of his decisions. But here's the twist. Those who were excluded from these banquets often found themselves on the outs politically, as though their absence sent a subtle message that they were no longer in favor. One particularly fascinating example comes from Emperor Augustus, who was known for using feasts as a way to reinforce his control over the Roman Senate. It's said that during one such banquet, Augustus deliberately invited certain senators who were loyal to him, while omitting those who had shown signs of discontent. By strategically selecting who could dine with him, he ensured that those at the table would be reminded of their place in the imperial order. These dinners were an extension of the emperor's power, a reminder that the emperor controlled not only the empire's wealth, but also the alliances and relationships that determined Rome's political future. But the political theater wasn't always subtle. Sometimes emperors would go out of their way to make a show of their power during banquets. They might invite rivals or enemies to the table, only to embarrass them publicly in front of the entire gathering. Such acts were often carefully calculated. Take Emperor Tiberius, for example. He was known for his skill in using banquets to humiliate his enemies. During one infamous dinner, he allegedly served his political adversaries food laced with insults disguised as jovial conversation. Of course, the guests had to play along, lest they suffer the wrath of the emperor. Historians still argue over how much of this was performance and how much was genuine tension between Tiberius and his guests. But what's clear is that for Tiberius and other emperors, the banquet wasn't just a meal. It was a venue for setting the political stage for the empire's future. On the other hand, banquets were also a way for emperors to celebrate their victories and bolster their image as rulers blessed by the gods. After a military conquest, the emperor would host a triumph, a massive public banquet that celebrated the victory. These events were often staged in grand fashion, with music, performances, and displays of wealth that made the emperor appear as though he had divine favor. It wasn't enough for the emperor to simply win battles. He had to make sure everyone knew about it. And there was no better way to do this than by hosting a banquet that showcased his military success, where each dish served symbolized his conquest and power. Guests would toast to his victories, eat food inspired by the lands he had conquered, and listen to speeches that praised the emperor's leadership. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Historians still argue about how much these banquets truly shaped Roman politics. Did the emperors use these gatherings to manipulate their guests into loyalty? Or were they simply a reflection of the imperial system? Some scholars suggest that these feasts were more than just power displays. They were a way for emperors to gauge the loyalty of their subjects and to solidify their support for the imperial regime. While the food and wine were the visible aspects of the banquet, the true goal was to ensure that everyone understood who held the power and the loyalty of those at the top of the social hierarchy. So, as you can imagine, the political dynamics at play during these Roman feasts were complex, and each gesture, each course, had significance. Now, as we move forward, let's shift our focus to another fascinating aspect of these banquets: the peculiar entertainment that was often featured, which sometimes even surpassed the food in its impact on the evening's road. As we continue exploring the intricacies of Roman banquets, we come to a truly unique and often bizarre aspect: the entertainment. We've already seen that the feasts were not just about food. They were about status, power, and theater. But what about the spectacle that accompanied these grand events? The Romans were known for their love of entertainment, and when it came to banquets, the emperor spared no expense in ensuring that the evening's activities were as extravagant as the meal itself. Picture this: the sounds of laughter and music fill the air as the guests settle in. But soon, the festivities take an unexpected turn. Instead of just enjoying the delicious food, the guests are treated to performances that range from the dramatic to the downright strange. At a Roman banquet, you might have witnessed gladiators fighting, perhaps not to the death, but certainly in fierce competition to entertain. It wasn't unusual for emperors to host mock gladiatorial battles during feasts, where trained fighters would perform, showing off their skills in front of an audience that included both the emperor and the highest-ranking officials in Rome. But this was just the beginning. In some cases, emperors would also invite acrobats, dancers, and musicians to provide further entertainment. Imagine a troupe of dancers performing intricate routines to the sounds of flutes and lyres, their movements synchronized in a way that could captivate the room. Some banquets even featured live theater, where actors would perform short plays or comedic skits for the guests, further solidifying the idea that a Roman banquet was as much about spectacle as it was about food. And if you thought that was wild, brace yourself for this. The emperor might also have arranged for exotic animals to be brought in for the entertainment. Lions, elephants, and even rhinoceroses, animals that had never been seen by the general public, would be paraded in front of the guests, much to their amazement. These animals were not only a display of the emperor's control over the far reaches of the empire, but also a way to add an element of drama to the evening. Imagine sitting at the table, sipping your wine, when suddenly a massive elephant is paraded through the hall, its trunk waving in the air, while the emperor beams with pride at his guests' reactions. Historians still argue about whether these displays were meant to showcase the emperor's power, or if they were simply a means of entertainment. Some argue that the emperor used these extravagant performances to reinforce the idea that he controlled the entire empire, including the wild beasts from the most distant lands. Others believe that these displays were more about appealing to the guests' senses, providing them with a thrilling experience that would keep them talking about the banquet long after it had ended. One of the most famous examples of such extravagant entertainment comes from the reign of Emperor Nero. It's said that Nero would often host elaborate feasts that included musical performances, theatrical plays, and even mock sea battles. These naumachii, as they were called, were staged on artificial lakes or flooded arenas, where ships would battle in front of a captivated audience. The sheer scale of these spectacles was meant to dazzle the guests and remind them of the emperor's boundless wealth and power. Can you imagine sitting there, watching ships clash in the midst of a banquet, while you savor your dormouse, stuffed with meat? It's a spectacle that seems almost too outlandish to be true, but for the Romans, it was the height of entertainment. And let's not forget the bizarre forms of entertainment that came with darker undertones. Some emperors, particularly those with more sinister reputations, would use the banquets to demonstrate their cruelty. Nero, again, is a prime example. He's said to have ordered the executions of political enemies during banquets, turning, now that we've explored the grandeur and spectacle of the entertainment during Roman feasts, it's time to zoom out and examine the broader cultural impact these banquets had on Roman society. You might think that such lavish events were reserved only for the elite. And while that's mostly true, these banquets were far from isolated affairs. In fact, they were a reflection of the broader Roman values. showcasing everything the empire stood for: luxury, power, and control. The emperor, by hosting these extravagant feasts, wasn't just feeding his guests. He was feeding an image, a carefully curated persona that was meant to embody Rome's might and influence over the world. Roman banquets were, in a sense, a public performance, a display of wealth and grandeur that reinforced the emperor's role as the undisputed ruler. The emperor's ability to provide such lavish events wasn't just about satisfying appetites. It was about asserting his divine right to rule. Every detail of the banquet, from the food to the entertainment, was a means of crafting an image of infallibility. And this wasn't just about impressing the elite guests in attendance. No, these banquets were designed to be discussed far beyond the marble halls of the emperor's palace. Word would spread about the emperor's feasts, and this would help to maintain his reputation across the empire. But these banquets were also a way of solidifying the social hierarchy within Rome. The seating arrangement alone spoke volumes about the social status of each guest. The emperor, seated at the highest point of the room, was the undisputed center of attention, with the most loyal subjects sitting closest to him. Those lower on the social ladder would find themselves positioned further away, reminding everyone of their place in the grand scheme of things. Even something as simple as where you sat at a Roman banquet could have significant political ramifications. Historians still argue whether these feasts were purely about opulence, or if they served a deeper, more strategic purpose in the emperor's rule. Some scholars believe that these banquets were a way for emperors to reward loyalty, while others argue that they were a method of manipulation, keeping guests in line through extravagant displays of power. One thing's for sure, though: the feasts were not just for indulgence. They were a tool in the emperor's toolbox, used to maintain control over the elite and to remind them that their place in Roman society was at the emperor's mercy. But the emperor's influence didn't stop with his immediate circle. The banquets also played a role in shaping public perception of Rome itself. A grand banquet, with all its exotic foods, entertainment, and displays of wealth, was a direct reflection of the empire's dominance over the known world. It wasn't just about impressing the guests who attended. It was about projecting Rome's image of power to the far reaches of the empire. Think of it as an early form of brand building, where the emperor was the face of Rome, and every banquet was a way to reinforce that image. This brings us to an interesting, often overlooked aspect of these feasts: how they influenced the social and cultural fabric of the Roman Empire. Roman feasts were not only an expression of imperial power, they were also a reflection of Roman values and tastes. The foods served at these banquets, exotic fruits, rare meats, and lavish desserts, became symbols of Rome's connection to the far corners of the empire. The banquets were a celebration of the empire's reach, a tangible demonstration of how Rome could procure delicacies from Egypt, Africa, Asia, and beyond. This cultural exchange was not just about food either. The entertainment, too, was a form of cultural diplomacy. The gladiators, the exotic animals, the musicians, and the dancers, all of these performers represented the diverse and expansive nature of the Roman Empire. And it wasn't just about the empire's power. It was about showing off its ability to absorb and incorporate different cultures into the Roman way of life. The emperor, by hosting such lavish banquets, was essentially displaying the empire's cultural melting pot, presenting Rome as a place where the world's riches and traditions could come together under one roof. Yet, while these banquets were a symbol of Rome's greatness, they were also a reminder of the rigid social structures that underpinned Roman life. The emperor, sitting at the head of the table, was a reminder of the emperor's absolute authority. And the guests, each one carefully selected for their position in society, were a representation of Rome's hierarchical nature. The banquets, then, were not just about opulence. They were about reinforcing the very social order that made the Roman Empire work. As we move through the decline of the Roman Empire, we can see how the grand feasts and banquets began to shift in their purpose and meaning. The grandeur of the early imperial feasts, as we reflect on the grandeur and cultural significance of Roman banquets, it's important to take a step back and appreciate how these feasts reached their golden age during the reigns of emperors like Augustus and his immediate successors. These emperors, who had the resources and political savvy to elevate the Roman banquet to an art form, knew that every meal hosted in their honor was more than just an opportunity to indulge their appetites. These banquets were crafted to solidify their positions as rulers and to further cement the idea of the emperor as both the political and divine center of Roman society. Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, is particularly notable for shaping the nature of these feasts. His reign marked the transition from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, and his political tactics reflected this shift. Augustus used banquets to not only celebrate his victories and the expansion of the empire, but also to project an image of Roman unity and stability. The emperor was the embodiment of Rome's greatness. And what better way to showcase that than by hosting feasts that included the best food, the most spectacular entertainment, and the most important figures in the empire? Under Augustus, the banquets were not only occasions for indulgence, but also for political maneuvering. These events allowed Augustus to reinforce his relationships with the Roman elite, to secure their loyalty and to remind them of their dependence on him. As the emperor hosted lavish feasts, he ensured that his guests understood the benefits of loyalty and the consequences of rebellion. A seat at the emperor's banquet table was a powerful sign of favor, and it also served as a public reminder of the emperor's ultimate control over Roman society. Historians still debate whether Augustus's use of banquets was a deliberate political strategy designed to build and maintain power, or whether it was simply the natural indulgence of a man at the height of his success. Some argue that his feasts were a calculated tool of soft power, while others suggest that he genuinely enjoyed the pleasures of the table. One thing is certain: Augustus understood that the spectacle of a grand feast, with its carefully curated menu and curated guest list, was a potent political tool that could be used to shape public perception and maintain control over the empire. Following Augustus, emperors like Tiberius, Caligula, and Claudius continued this tradition, each bringing their own twist to the lavish banquets. Caligula, in particular, is often remembered for his more eccentric feasts, which seemed designed to shock and awe his guests. Under his reign, banquets took on a more theatrical quality, with strange and often disturbing elements that defied Roman tradition. Some accounts suggest that Caligula, for example, would have guests attend a banquet and then subject them to bizarre rituals or humiliating acts. While some of these stories are likely exaggerated, they do highlight the way feasts became a tool not just for political calculation, but for displaying the emperor's absolute control over life and death. Yet, as we move further into the history of Roman banquets, we also see a shift. The reigns of emperors like Nero and Domitian marked a change in the way these feasts were perceived. As the empire began to decline, so too did the extravagant displays of wealth and power that had once been a staple of Roman life. The grand banquets that had once symbolized imperial strength and unity began to lose their luster, becoming more self-indulgent and disconnected from the realities of the empire's struggles. Historians still argue whether the decadence of these later emperors was a symptom of the empire's decline, or whether it was simply a sign of their personal excesses. Nero, for instance, is notorious for his lavish feasts, where he indulged in every whim and used the banquets as a platform for his artistic ambitions. He was known for inviting guests to performances of his own musical compositions, forcing them to sit through hours of his unpolished performances. In his case, the feast was not so much about the food, the drink, or the entertainment, but about his need for adoration and his desire to be seen as a great artistic figure. despite the excesses of emperors like Nero, there was a deeper cultural shift taking place. The Roman Empire, once unified under the banner of imperial grandeur, was beginning to fracture. The wealth and power that had fueled these grand banquets were being stretched thin, and the larger-than-life feasts began to reflect the crumbling infrastructure of the empire. The lavish banquets that had once been a tool of imperial power were now seen by some as a sign of the emperor's detachment from the struggles of the Roman people. As the empire's resources dwindled, the opulence of these banquets became increasingly out of touch with the reality faced by the common citizen. But even as the empire's grandeur waned, as we shift into the later stages of Roman history, it's fascinating to consider how the culture of grand feasts continued to evolve, even as the empire itself began to crumble. The high point of Roman banquets, marked by the peak of imperial power, may have passed, but the essence of these gatherings remained a key part of Roman identity. By the time we reach the 3rd century CE, the nature of Roman banquets started to shift significantly. As Rome's political and economic systems began to falter, so too did the opulent feasts that had once defined the imperial experience. This period saw a noticeable decline in the lavish banquets that had been the hallmark of earlier emperors. No longer could the empire sustain the enormous wealth required to support these extravagant affairs. The banquet, which had once been a symbol of the emperor's divine right to rule, now seemed increasingly out of place in a world where economic instability, military pressures, and political intrigue were the order of the day. The era of decadence began to fade, and what had once been a grand display of imperial power was now a mere reflection of Rome's crumbling grandeur. In the latter days of the empire, some emperors tried to hold on to the traditions of the lavish banquet, but rather than focusing on elaborate feasts as symbols of power, these later emperors often found themselves surrounded by lavish displays of excess, which seemed more like a desperate attempt to hold on to the glory of the past than a true expression of imperial might. The once thriving banquets, which had been carefully curated as events of political importance, had become more about indulging personal desires and less about asserting dominance. Yet, despite this decline in extravagance, the social dynamics of Roman feasts persisted in an altered form. The social hierarchy that had been reinforced by the seating arrangements at imperial banquets and the carefully curated guest lists continued to influence gatherings within the empire, even as the empire itself fragmented. While the larger, grandiose feasts became less frequent, smaller, more intimate banquets still served as a venue for the elite to reinforce their power and status. The guest lists became more personal, and the feasts became an opportunity for the emperor to demonstrate their continued importance to the people around them. Historians often point out that this shift in banquet culture mirrored the transformation of Rome from an empire centered around a single, powerful emperor to a more fragmented political system. As the empire broke into multiple regions, with various power players vying for control, the Roman banquet shifted from a symbol of centralized imperial power to a reflection of the decentralized nature of the later empire. The lavish dinners of the past were now replaced by smaller-scale gatherings, where politics were often more subtle but still present. While these later banquets might not have had the same dramatic flair as those in the days of Augustus or Tiberius, they still served an important role in shaping the relationships and alliances between the various factions vying for control. The shift in scale didn't reduce the importance of these gatherings. If anything, the subtlety of later Roman banquets made them more insidious, often serving as a way for those in power to reinforce alliances or settle disputes behind closed doors, without the overt spectacle that had characterized the earlier feasts. Despite these shifts, the legacy of the Roman feast remains inextricably tied to the idea of political theater. Whether it was a lavish banquet held by an emperor who sought to flaunt his dominance, or a smaller, more intimate gathering used for political maneuvering, the function of the feast as a tool of social control and a reflection of imperial authority continued. The Roman banquet, in its various forms, served as a space where power was both exerted and reinforced, through not only the food and drink served, but the relationships forged, the alliances solidified, and the rivalries quelled. But as the empire began to fragment, and the Western Roman Empire eventually fell in 476 CE, these feasts became relics of a past era, although their influence continued to resonate in the cultures that followed. Medieval banquets, for example, would draw heavily on Roman traditions, using feasts not only as an expression of wealth, but also as a vehicle for political and social commentary. The idea of using food and drink as a symbol of power would live on in different forms throughout history, from the Renaissance courts to the grand state dinners of modern times. Even today, the legacy of the Roman banquet can be seen in our own gatherings. The ways we use food, drink, and entertainment to create a certain ambiance at celebrations and public events echo the Roman tradition of feasting as an art form. So, when you attend a formal dinner or a grand celebration, remember, as we move further into the transformation of the Roman feast tradition, we can't overlook how the fall of the Western Roman Empire marked a significant turning point in the culture of banqueting. By the 5th century CE, as the empire was slowly disintegrating, the grandeur of imperial feasts began to fade into the background. With Rome no longer the center of the world, the concept of the banquet as a political spectacle became less relevant. The luxurious banquets that had once been used to reinforce imperial power gradually transformed into more modest affairs, reflecting the changing political, economic, and cultural realities of the time. The collapse of centralized power in Rome meant that these grand feasts, with their elaborate menus and spectacular entertainment, no longer held the same sway. In fact, many of the elements that defined Roman banquets, such as the careful curation of guest lists, the focus on political power, and the extravagant displays of wealth, became less central to the gatherings that took place in the medieval world. However, the influence of Roman dining culture continued to linger in various forms, particularly in the courts of the early medieval period. In the wake of Rome's fall, the feasts that emerged in the medieval period were often more focused on communal aspects, especially in the early stages of feudal society. No longer were the banquets primarily about displaying imperial might. They became more about bringing people together to share in a meal, often in celebration of harvests or religious holidays. While the extravagant excess of the Roman imperial banquet was largely absent, the importance of communal dining persisted. These meals were still grand events, just more focused on community and less on political statements. That said, medieval feasts still carried with them echoes of the Roman banquet tradition. The concept of the banquet as an important social occasion continued to be a key part of medieval life, particularly within the royal courts. Monarchs and nobles continued to host lavish feasts, albeit smaller in scale than those of the Roman emperors. These medieval banquets, much like their Roman predecessors, served as an opportunity for the elite to display their wealth and power, though in a less overtly political way. The guest lists were still carefully curated, and the seating arrangements were often dictated by social status. Just as in Rome, where the emperor controlled the seating arrangements, the host of a medieval feast determined where each guest would sit, reinforcing their social hierarchy. The entertainment during these medieval feasts also had its roots in Roman banquets, though it had evolved. Instead of gladiatorial combat or exotic animal displays, the medieval banquet often featured musicians, dancers, and minstrels who performed for the assembled guests. However, the social functions of these banquets remained largely the same. The feasts were a way for the nobility to reinforce their position in society and to establish and solidify relationships with other members of the elite. The act of sharing a meal was as much about politics and alliance building as it was about enjoyment. Interestingly, the Roman tradition of using food to express power and identity didn't disappear entirely. Some aspects of Roman culinary culture survived, influencing the foods served at these early medieval feasts. Dishes like roasted meats, bread, and wine continued to feature prominently at tables, but with a distinctly medieval twist. Medieval cooks adopted some Roman techniques of preserving food, like salting and pickling, and continued to serve hearty dishes that reflected the agrarian society in which they lived. Banquets, while no longer a grand display of imperial domination, still had the ability to convey a message about who controlled the land, who had the wealth, and who held the power. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and we see another revival of the grand banquet tradition, this time shaped by the rebirth of classical culture. During this period, the Roman influence on feasting re-emerged with full force. Renaissance courts, particularly in Italy, began to mimic the lavish banquets of the Romans, with extravagant courses, ornate settings, and elaborate entertainment. The use of food as a form of political theater resurfaced, though now it was more about displaying the patronage and cultural superiority of the host. The Renaissance banquet also saw the return of the idea of the banquet as a space for intellectual conversation, with scholars, poets, and artists often invited to join the festivities. But despite this resurgence, the feasts of the Renaissance were still quite different from their Roman counterparts. The emphasis on excess was tempered by a new focus on refinement and taste. Gone were the days of dormice stuffed with exotic meats, replaced by dishes that showcased the culinary sophistication of the time. The Renaissance As we step deeper into the transformation of the banquet culture, it's interesting to look at how food itself, once a symbol of power and extravagance, began to take on new roles and meanings as Roman feasts became less common. While the grand imperial banquets started to fade with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the customs, the flavors, and even the ritual of feasting continued to permeate life, albeit in different ways. These changes weren't simply about food, although food was certainly still a part of it. They represented a shift in how society viewed the relationship between rulers and their people, and how food was used not just for indulgence, but for cultural continuity. In the medieval period, even though the large-scale, extravagant feasts of the Roman Empire were a thing of the past, the practice of holding feasts remained a cultural cornerstone. These were not the political spectacles that the Romans had perfected. Instead, feasts became more about community and tradition, events where lords and vassals came together not just to dine, but to reinforce bonds of loyalty and kinship. While the elite still enjoyed sumptuous meals, the focus was more on hospitality than showing off power. The banquets still served as a place where rulers could reaffirm their position, but the tone had shifted. The level of opulence had decreased, and with it, the need for such elaborate displays of wealth and status. However, one element of the Roman banquet tradition that never truly disappeared was the idea of food as an expression of identity. Whether in the medieval courts or later during the Renaissance, food continued to symbolize power and influence, but now in a more nuanced way. The role of food in these feasts became a reflection of local, regional, and national identities. Emperors and nobles still used feasts to celebrate their cultural heritage and assert their prominence, but the extravagant ingredients of the past, imported delicacies from distant lands, were replaced by more familiar local offerings. Take, for example, the Renaissance court feasts, where the cultural revival of Roman traditions brought back the grandeur of old, but with a shift in emphasis. The grand dishes of the Roman Empire, exotic meats, intricate recipes, and displays of wealth through food were revived, but they were adapted to the tastes and realities of the Renaissance. Renaissance chefs, inspired by the culinary traditions of ancient Rome, worked to recreate some of the classic dishes, but they also sought to refine them, using more familiar, local ingredients. In this way, the legacy of Roman banquets lived on in the Renaissance court kitchens, with chefs drawing inspiration from both ancient Roman texts and their own culinary traditions. What we see is a fusion of old and new. The food might not have been as extravagant as in the days of the Roman Empire, but it was still designed to impress. The abundance of food, the presentation, and the sheer creativity of the banquets all reflected the Renaissance ideals of sophistication and culture. Food, once again, was used to elevate the status of those who hosted the feast and to reinforce their place at the top of the social order. Interestingly, as we move from the Renaissance into the modern world, the purpose and scope of banquets change once again. The idea of food as a power display may have diminished in some contexts, but its role as a symbol of wealth and social stature remained. State dinners, galas, and even the grandest corporate events still use food as a way to impress guests, promote prestige, and symbolize cultural or national pride. In many ways, modern feasts continue the traditions of the Romans, albeit in a less overtly political manner. In our modern times, banquets might not involve gladiator fights or exotic animals paraded across the floor, but the core concept remains the same. Food is central to creating an atmosphere of grandeur and influence. Think about high-end corporate dinners, weddings with elaborate catering, or even the meals shared at heads of state summits. At their core, these events are often about more than just the meal. They're about the message the hosts wish to send. Whether it's an emperor, a king, or a modern CEO, the feast still serves as a method of cultural expression and a way to maintain social hierarchies. These meals are still opportunities for the elite to reinforce their dominance and display their cultural sophistication. There is, however, a more personal aspect to these modern feasts that harkens back to the communal aspects of medieval and ancient feasts. Today, we see a resurgence in the idea of food as a means of connection, a way for families, friends, and even strangers to gather around a table and share in the joy of eating. While modern society may be less focused on politics and power dynamics, the role of food in building community has not been lost. In fact, the popularity of dinner parties, potlucks, and food, now that we've ventured through the layers of Roman feasts, from their political power plays to their eventual decline, let's slow down and reflect on the way these banquets left their mark on the world, both in the immediate centuries after the fall of Rome and in the more distant future. As we trace the history of feasting from ancient Rome into the Middle Ages and beyond, one thing becomes abundantly clear. The essence of the Roman banquet, its use of food, drink, and entertainment as symbols of power and identity, continues to influence our own dining traditions, even if we don't always realize it. In the immediate aftermath of Rome's collapse, Europe entered a period known as the Dark Ages, where grand feasts became less about displays of imperial power and more about the communal gathering of people in a fractured society. With the fall of centralized Roman authority, the lavish and politically charged banquets of emperors gave way to simpler, more localized meals. However, even as the grandeur of Roman feasts faded, the idea of feasting as a communal event, one that brought people together, persisted. In the feudal system that emerged during the Middle Ages, lords and knights continued to host banquets, though these events were far more restrained than their Roman counterparts. The rich and powerful still used these gatherings to reinforce social hierarchies and cement political alliances, but they were no longer the opulent affairs that characterized the Roman Empire. Medieval feasts, although less extravagant, still served as a platform for showing off one's wealth and power. The guest lists were still curated with great care, and the seating arrangements remained a symbol of social order. Yet even in these more subdued gatherings, traces of Roman banquet culture endured. The tradition of the feast as a social and political tool continued to influence the way medieval lords used food to control and impress. It wasn't just about sharing a meal, it was about reaffirming one's place in the hierarchy. Just as Roman emperors used food to symbolize their dominance, medieval rulers continued the tradition of using banquets to solidify alliances and demonstrate their control over their land and people. As we move into the Renaissance, we see a revival of Roman-inspired banqueting culture. During this period, there was a renewed interest in classical Roman traditions, which included the revival of grand feasts. But unlike the earlier Roman banquets that were used as tools of political power, Renaissance feasts began to take on a new, more intellectual and cultural focus. These banquets became venues for not just political maneuvering, but for artistic and intellectual expression. The food at Renaissance feasts was still lavish, but now it was also refined and sophisticated, reflecting the humanist values of the time. It was during this time that the concept of the banquet truly began to shift from a purely political event to one that was also about cultural exchange. Intellectuals, poets, and artists were often invited to Renaissance feasts, and the meals themselves became opportunities to showcase creativity and sophistication. The art of the banquet, its food, its presentation, its entertainment, was seen as a way to elevate not just the body, but the mind and spirit. While the political significance of these banquets was still present, there was also a shift toward celebrating culture, art, and human achievement. This transformation in banquet culture was also reflected in the foods served. While the extravagant ingredients of the Roman era, exotic meats, strange delicacies, had long since fallen out of favor, Renaissance chefs focused on creating visually stunning dishes that reflected the intellectual and artistic values of the time. Meals became works of art in their own right, with chefs using color, texture, and arrangement to impress guests. Food was no longer just about luxury. It was about creativity, artistry, and cultural identity. Banquets, once a means of political control, had now become celebrations of human achievement, symbolizing the rebirth of classical ideals and the growing influence of culture and intellect in European society. As we move into the modern era, the influence of Roman feasts is still felt. Today, while the political power dynamics and the lavish extravagance of Roman banquets may seem like a distant memory, the concept of using food to create an experience, to bring people together, and to celebrate culture still holds strong. Whether it's a wedding reception, a state dinner, or a family gathering, the act of sharing food remains a deeply rooted tradition that symbolizes connection, status, and celebration. Interestingly, in modern times, we've also seen the rise of food as a form of rebellion. Just as the Romans used their banquets to showcase their power, modern chefs and food activists use food to challenge cultural norms and push boundaries. The food world has as we wind down the story of Roman banquets and their lasting legacy. It's essential to recognize how the evolution of feasting mirrors the broader changes in human society. While the ancient Roman banquet was a symbol of imperial power and grandeur, it was also a reflection of Roman values: order, discipline, and control. As the centuries passed, the banquets of later cultures, from the medieval lords to Renaissance monarchs and modern chefs, adapted these same ideas to suit their own needs. The grand Roman banquet, once a tool of domination, slowly transformed into a communal event, a symbol of shared experiences rather than of domination. In the post-Roman world, as Europe fractured and the empire's political structure crumbled, food began to take on new meanings. Feasts were still important, but the power dynamics that once governed Roman banquets became less overt. Kings and lords continued to host lavish feasts, but these gatherings were no longer simply about reinforcing imperial control. Instead, they became more focused on consolidating power locally, securing loyalty, and maintaining the complex social order of feudal systems. Yet, even as political power shifted away from Rome's imperial model, the banquet remained a powerful cultural institution. The medieval banquet still drew inspiration from Roman traditions, though now food became a means of displaying cultural sophistication rather than imperial control. The choice of ingredients, the presentation of dishes, and the grandeur of the feast all still served as markers of social class. But these feasts were now much more concerned with showing off one's status within the narrower confines of regional power structures. Fast forward to the Renaissance, and we see the rebirth of not only classical art and architecture, but also the classical banquet. The Renaissance was a period of great intellectual and artistic achievement, and its banquets reflected that. In many ways, Renaissance feasts resembled Roman banquets in their grandeur, but there was a noticeable shift. Rather than serving as purely political displays, these feasts began to symbolize a new kind of cultural power. They became a means of demonstrating artistic refinement and intellectual sophistication, as much about the conversation and entertainment as the food itself. But the essence of Roman feasts remained intact. Just as the emperors had used banquets to reinforce their power, Renaissance hosts used feasts to display their wealth and position within society. The concept of food as a marker of social status continued to thrive, and the elaborate culinary creations served at these feasts were designed not just to satiate, but to impress. Whether it was a table full of exotic fruits, intricately prepared meats, or stunning desserts, food was still very much a way of saying, "I have arrived, and I am in control." The influence of Roman feasting traditions on the Renaissance period is undeniable. But as we move beyond this era and into the modern world, we begin to see a significant shift. In the modern era, the concept of feasting has evolved to reflect different values. While banquets still hold an important place in modern society, think of state dinners, galas, and wedding receptions, their purpose has shifted from political power displays to more symbolic gatherings. Today, food is less often about asserting power and more often about connection and celebration. The banquets of modern times, while still imbued with a sense of formality and tradition, are now about creating experiences that bring people together, regardless of their social standing. Modern feasts often focus on the communal aspect of dining, and as such, they reflect a shift away from the hierarchical power structures of the past. Rather than reinforcing class distinctions, these gatherings tend to break down social barriers, offering a chance for guests to connect over shared experiences. Whether at a family meal, a casual dinner party, or a grand wedding feast, the focus has shifted to the joy of shared eating, celebrating relationships, and marking milestones. In this way, the legacy of the Roman banquet has been transformed, but it remains rooted in the human need to connect and share experiences with others. In fact, the communal aspect of modern dining is perhaps the most enduring aspect of the Roman feast that has survived through the centuries. Whether it's a formal event or a simple dinner with friends, the act of coming together to share food has remained one of the most fundamental expressions of human society. Even as the grand spectacle of Roman banquets faded into history, the tradition of gathering around a table to eat, drink, and celebrate life has remained a timeless and universal custom. The same rituals that defined Roman banquets, the careful selection of guests, the order of seating, the ceremonial presentation of food, can still be seen in modern banquets, though they may not carry the same. As we approach the final chapter of our exploration into the legacy of Roman feasts, it's important to reflect on how the rituals surrounding dining have evolved in the context of today's society. While the grandeur of Roman banquets, the opulent displays of power, and the elaborate food presentations may no longer dominate the political landscape, the essential role of food as a form of expression and connection remains. The very concept of feasting, gathering around a table to share a meal, still carries the echoes of those ancient Roman practices, albeit in a much different form. In modern times, the focus has shifted significantly. The modern banquet is no longer a tool for reinforcing imperial or monarchical power, but it retains its power to bring people together, to foster social bonds, and to celebrate milestones. Whether it's a wedding, a birthday, a state dinner, or a community potluck, the act of gathering around a table continues to be one of the most powerful forms of social connection. The idea of using food as a symbol of power has given way to food as a symbol of joy, unity, and shared experience. But despite these changes, the ancient Roman tradition of using food to make a statement about identity has not disappeared. Instead, it's simply been reinterpreted. While you might not be served a stuffed dormouse or a flamingo tongue at your next dinner party, the importance of the meal in social gatherings remains. The choice of food at a modern banquet still communicates something about the host and their values. Whether it's a menu carefully curated to showcase the host's sophistication, their love of local ingredients, or their commitment to sustainability, food is still a medium through which people express themselves. Modern food culture is also influenced by the same ideals that permeated Roman feasts. Just as the Romans used exotic spices and rare ingredients to demonstrate their reach across the empire, today's chefs often incorporate ingredients from around the world to create menus that showcase global influences. The world has become more interconnected than ever before, and food is a reflection of this new global tapestry. Much like the Roman emperors once displayed their control over distant lands through the food served at their banquets, modern chefs often use food as a way to tell stories about different cultures, histories, and traditions. But beyond the food itself, the experience of the modern banquet has shifted in its emphasis. It's no longer just about what's on the plate, but how the experience is framed. In many ways, the modern dinner party is less about the meal itself and more about the social dynamic it fosters. The food, while important, serves as a backdrop for conversation, bonding, and connection. This shift from food as spectacle to food as connection reflects a broader change in society. From an era of hierarchical, power-driven displays to an era that values shared experiences and personal relationships. It's fascinating to think about how this shift mirrors the decline of Roman imperial feasts. As the empire faltered, so too did the political spectacle of the Roman banquet. The feasts that once acted as a tool for demonstrating imperial authority were eventually replaced by more modest gatherings that focused more on community and personal connection than on power dynamics. Modern society has only continued this trend, emphasizing food as a medium for socialization rather than power. This evolution is a testament to how deeply food has been ingrained in human culture, adapting and transforming with the times, while maintaining its central role in connecting us. Yet, despite the evolution, the echoes of those Roman banquets still resonate. When you attend a state dinner, a wedding feast, or even a casual dinner with friends, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back thousands of years. The rituals may have changed, the foods may have evolved, but the fundamental purpose of the banquet, bringing people together to share in a moment of celebration, whether personal or political, remains. It's a shared humanity that has been passed down through the ages, from the emperors of Rome to the leaders of today. Looking back at the grandeur of those Roman feasts, with their exotic meats, endless wine, and political intrigue, it's hard not to feel a sense of awe. But when we look at our own dining traditions today, we realize that the true legacy of Roman banquets isn't necessarily in their opulence or spectacle. It's in the timeless ritual of gathering around a table, sharing food, and making memories together. Whether it's a simple meal at home or a grand celebration, the act of coming together to share food continues to be one of the most profound ways we connect with each other, honor our relationships, and celebrate life's moments. In many ways, the Roman feast, with all its excesses and grandeur, was a precursor to the idea of food as an experience. And here we are, at the final part of our journey through Roman feasts and their enduring legacy. As we wind down, it's important to appreciate not only how these grand meals shaped the course of history, but also how they continue to influence us today. From their early days of imperial power to their more modern forms, the Roman banquet has been a symbol of more than just wealth or political power. At its heart, it has always been about connection, about people gathering together, whether for political reasons, social bonding, or simply to share in a moment of celebration. In ancient Rome, the feast was a powerful tool used by emperors to reinforce their authority. It wasn't just about food. It was about presenting the emperor as the center of the empire, both literally and figuratively. The guest lists, the seating arrangements, the carefully curated menu, all of these elements were designed to ensure that power was on display, to remind those present of the emperor's unrivaled position. And while the opulence of these events might seem excessive, it was all part of a broader strategy to keep the political order intact and to remind everyone of their place in society. Fast forward to the fall of Rome and the medieval period, and we see how these same banqueting traditions evolved. In the wake of the Roman Empire's collapse, the lavish political feasts became less about imperial dominance and more about local power and communal relationships. Lords and knights still used banquets to consolidate power and strengthen alliances. But the overt political theater of Roman banquets gave way to more personal, localized gatherings. The food, once a display of imperial wealth, became more about reflecting the cultural identity of the region. The grand feasts persisted, but they became quieter affairs, with an emphasis on community rather than empire building. Then, as we reach the Renaissance, we see a revival of Roman-inspired feasting. The ideals of classical antiquity came back into fashion, and with them came the grand feasts once again. But now, the focus shifted from political power to intellectual and cultural achievement. The Renaissance banquet was a celebration of art, culture, and sophistication. While it still bore the trappings of Roman grandeur, the emphasis was less on the emperor's divine right to rule and more on human achievement and the celebration of creativity and intellectual pursuits. Food was still important, but it became a medium through which culture, intellect, and artistic refinement were expressed. And now, in the modern era, we see how food has evolved from a symbol of power and political control to a universal language of connection. While the lavish banquets of the past may seem distant and unattainable, the essence of those feasts, the joy of sharing a meal, the importance of socializing, and the act of bringing people together is as relevant today as it ever was. Modern feasts, whether they are weddings, corporate events, or family gatherings, still carry the essence of those ancient traditions. While the politics may have changed, the central role of food in human connection has remained constant. At its core, the Roman banquet was always about more than just food. It was about creating a space where power could be reinforced, alliances could be forged, and relationships could be solidified. It was about showing who was in charge and who was loyal. As time passed, the banquet's role shifted, but it never lost its essence. Whether in ancient Rome or in a modern dining room, food remains a medium through which we express who we are, what we value, and how we connect with each other. As we finish our journey through the history of Roman feasts, it's worth considering how this legacy has shaped our own experiences with food. The act of sharing a meal, whether in the grand halls of an emperor's palace or at a modest family dinner table, is still a powerful way to create community, build relationships, and celebrate life's milestones. The Roman banquet may have been an extravagant display of power, but at its heart, it was also a celebration of the human desire to connect, share, and celebrate life. And that, in many ways, is what makes the Roman feast so timeless. Now, as we drift into the quiet of the night, think of the meals you've shared with friends, family, or loved ones. The bonds that were strengthened over a shared dish. The laughter that filled the room. The connection that grew stronger with every bite. Food, as it was in ancient Rome, continues to be a way to bring people together, to reinforce relationships, and to mark the important moments in our lives. In this way, the legacy of the Roman banquet lives on, not in the lavish excess, but in the simple joy of breaking bread with others. So, as you settle in, let the memories of these shared moments of connection, warmth, and unity carry you gently to sleep.